The Marvel Cinematic Universe has been in pop culture for so long that it's hard to remember a time when its mark on the film industry wasn't blatantly obvious. I was born in 2003 and I was 5 when the first entry to the soon-to-be expansive franchise released and ignited the spark that would later build into one interconnected timeline. It'd never been done before, to have all these characters with their own standalone movies come together in one climactic event. It was a feeling that's hard to come across now, that you're witnessing the birth of something special that could never again be replicated with the same resonance. The Avengers was the first film in the MCU I ever saw, and at the time it blew my mind, an explosion of spectacle, action and cool character dynamics. The result of all these various worlds clashing into one. And from there it kept going and going. It may sound stupid, but some of my most standout memories to do with going to the cinema are closely associated to films in this franchise. Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, The Winter Soldier in both Infinity War and Endgame. The climax to this universe, spanning a decade and over 20 films, filled to the brim with the very thing we fell in love with in the first Avengers. Amazing spectacle, creative action and an incredible focus on characters and the relationships that drive every aspect of these movies. We got to see these characters' lowest points and their highest highs, we got to see resolutions to plot lines and character arcs spanning years, all ending in a way that closed the book on these characters' journeys and more broadly and arguably an end to a universe that had weaved through all these different works. But nothing ever truly ends. The MCU is the largest film franchise on the planet. Star Wars got decked in the fucking mouth by Marvel a million times over. Every film garnering profit, a passionate fan base, and a practically unlimited stream of new content. Money speaks louder than anything else. Disney had a streaming service to push, actors to utilize, and characters to keep expanding on. To the people who say the MCU should have ended after Endgame, I agree, but you're stupid. These movies make more money than any other film in the industry, and the MCU has more characters than the ones that are swimming with the fishes alongside Topher Grace and Bullseye's baseball coach. The well has admittedly dried up for people like Captain America. He's had his story, his origin, his lows, his loss, his conflict, and at the end, his story comes full circle. Characters like Spider-Man and the Guardians still have stories to tell and places to go. The MCU continuing life was inevitable, and I wouldn't be so ignorant to say that it could never go forward and move past the story that was told prior to Endgame. But as of right now, the MCU has no story. This recent slate of films and TV shows making up Phase 4 has been a jumbled mess of ideas and storylines. They're the cinematic universe equivalent of a headless chicken running around without any clear sense of direction. Black Widow, Shang-Chi, WandaVision, Loki, What If, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Eternals, Spider-Man No Way Home, Hawkeye, Moon Knight, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness are all projects that are a part of this new direction that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been following, and I don't fuck with it. Which is by no means a debatable statement or hot take. There seems to be a growing sentiment that Marvel's recent releases have been a downgrade from stuff that preceded it. Taking quality out of the equation, the interest for certain properties has definitely died down. Nobody is really talking about the MCU that much anymore. People aren't feeling obligated to go see these movies and TV shows for a myriad of reasons. It feels nowadays that the MCU is running on fumes instead of the nuclear generator it used to have going for it during its peak. Iron Man, Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, Thor Ragnarok, The Winter Soldier, and Civil War all helped to generate hype. Not just because they were great setups for future movies or great culminations of years of continuity, but because they were just generally great movies. I can't speak for everyone, but for me, my interest in the MCU and its content is motivated now from a place of obligation. Like, oh, there's a new Marvel movie coming out, I'll watch it so I'm not behind or missing out on a good 30 minutes of conversation with somebody. Which, let's be real, is kind of business as usual for these movies. I'm not gonna sit here and act like me watching Thor 2 or Ant-Man and the Wasp was motivated by anything other than obligation or me thinking that it was gonna be important for the wider story of this universe. And that's just it. Marvel has no plan anymore, it has no direction. Its story concluded and its grand finale came to an end, with no endgame to the endgame other than the faint concept of trying to build on top of these characters we've come to know and love. But it insists on using the same old bag of tricks it's been using since it first dipped its toe into the idea of an expanded, symbiotic cinematic universe. Those being to stay in the box to keep the stories generic, short and simple, not take risks, and to use each project as an advertisement for the next. Even though my tone may sound negative, and that's because, well, it is. For the most part, I don't think Marvel Studios was making a wrong decision in taking this direction early in its life. Many franchises have come and gone due to doing too much too fast, but Marvel had an advantage over the rest of them in having a grand architect to steer the ship in the right direction and make sure that everything was up to code. Kevin Feige knew that having a strategy and taking it slow is what would pay dividends in the long term. So the idea was formed that sets of movies would be organized into phases, highlighting a specific arc and purpose to the overall story they were telling. Phase 1 was Iron Man, the Hulk, Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America, and the Avengers, with the overall goal and story arc being to create the building blocks for an interconnected cinematic universe. Phase 2 featured Iron Man 3, Thor the Dark World, Guardians of the Galaxy, Ant-Man, the Winter Soldier, and Age of Ultron, with the primary idea being to build upon the building blocks that were established in Phase 1, placing a large focus on the world building, establishing its politics, its unseen past, and expanding the MCU's scope towards the weird cosmic side of the universe. Also, your mileage may vary because this was a separate division from Marvel Studios, but around this time you got to see the rollout of Marvel TV within this universe. Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter all coming out to make the universe broader and fill in the gaps the movies didn't have time for, but we'll get into that in more detail later down the road. Phase 3 was when they got experimental. Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Civil War, Spider-Man Homecoming, Thor Ragnarok, Black Panther, Infinity War, and Endgame. This is when they got comfortable with playing around with this interconnected universe. Prior to this point, a big meme was that all this end of the world shit was going down, but despite referencing the events of previous movies and other characters, rarely would you see an actual crossover outside of the big team-ups like the Avengers. But in Phase 3 you had all these different characters crossing over, talking to each other, fighting each other. Some new players were established. Doctor Strange could show up in Thor for 2 minutes, Iron Man and Spider-Man could share the screen, and it would all feel natural and not alienating. The universe was even more fleshed out as it started to shed its more grounded foundations for more out there and comic booky sensibilities. Thor went to space, Doctor Strange dealt with wizards and other dimensions, the cosmic side of the universe was better explored, and you start to see a slight variation in styles between projects. Before Phase 3, Marvel was very committed to making everything feel homogenous with one another. Every movie looked the same, tones never really varied, and was a massive point of criticism that was mostly unaddressed by Marvel during that time, which makes it sound like they fixed it later, but I'd be a liar if I said Phase 3 was creator driven or that each movie was distinct, because no, they weren't. They were each very obviously Marvel movies, mostly directed by people hired to get the job done and collect their paycheck. But some colour got injected into them, they weren't all grey and boring looking. Colours popped, locations varied, and some directors were afforded the opportunity to incorporate more style. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 feels like a James Gunn movie. Likewise, Thor Ragnarok felt like a Taika Waititi movie and injected new life into one of the most boring and one note of the MCU's main cast. I deviated quite a way away from talking about Marvel's phases there, so to briefly circle back around, Phase 3's main focus was to combine most of the elements they had learned throughout their tenure. Multi-movie spanning storytelling, more comfort in playing with the universe and tying everything all together for their finale. Now, I'm not aware of the inner intricacies of Marvel Studios and the comings and goings of their operation, but if I were to hazard a guess, post-finale they were consulting the sacred chart and working their way for about a dozen chickens, because Phase 4 currently has no overarching goal or major storyline to build towards. The closest thing you can point to is this whole multiverse thing, the idea that there is an infinite amount of universes all running parallel to the one we see. You've all seen Spider-Verse, you get the idea. But out of the 11 entries into Phase 4, only 3 of them actually explore that concept. And Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and Loki almost have nothing to do with each other, except that they all share a vaguely similar story concept. I guess you could argue that because Loki broke open the multiverse, that's the catalyst for the Green Goblin and Eddie Brock breaking through into the main universe, but there's no TVA, no mention or reference to the events of that series and the how or the why all of this is happening. When No Way Home ended and after Eddie Brock pissed off left his goop and Morbius met up with the Vulture, the post-credit scene showed a trailer for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which makes it look like the events of that movie would follow on from No Way Home. That Doctor Strange cracking open the multiverse to allow the Sinister Six and 2 other Spider-Man to enter resulted in the multiverse crashing in on itself, adding more weight to the finale of Loki and what Kang said would happen. But then I actually watched the movie, and aside from exactly one exchange, the plot of No Way Home has absolutely no bearing on the story of Doctor Strange. It just ended up being about how Strange is lonely, and the whole multiverse angle was an incredibly minor part of its actual story. And I have no problem with these films being isolated, in fact I welcome it. Part of why DC is doing so well right now is because they're more focused on standalone projects instead of being overly ambitious in setting up future projects and having their cinematic universes remain connected. They're diversifying, creating a lot of different projects for different characters with radically different tones, which is what Marvel should be doing right now. But even though some films and shows have some pizzazz now that they didn't used to have, the writing of each of these is still so samey. There's no risk and no variation in ways that aren't surface level. Say what you will about the Netflix MCU shows and their fluctuation in quality, but at the very least they all felt different. Luke Cage was a show focused on Black American issues and incorporated that into its style and writing. Jessica Jones was a light noir detective show, and Daredevil was an action crime drama. Each one has various styles and writing sensibilities. And sure, some suck, but others are okay to incredible pieces of television that stand on their own. I can't say the same for any of the shows that were officially produced and overseen by Marvel Studios. With the exception of Moon Knight, each show seems more committed to being an advertisement for future projects, with brief flourishes and minor trippy visuals to allude to having more style than they actually have. When WandaVision was coming out, people were interested in how the show would function as a metaphor and exploration of grief. The sitcom setup of the show works as an expression of nostalgia for a life you no longer have and the loved ones you no longer get to spend time with, as well as the desire to cling on to a potential future you cannot obtain due to their loss. If the show scaled back their ambition and focused purely on its characters and their journey, it would have been a much stronger show. To just make it a short, small-scale story set in this world about an otherwise disposable character. But what we ended up getting was a show that convoluted itself with evil government groups, witches, and setting up future projects. Remember that really weird moment in the last episode when the Skrull from Captain Marvel showed up to set up the Marvels coming out in 2023? Or when Wanda had her peaceful little cottage in the forest with her astral form menacingly studying the Necronomicon to set up Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, releasing in May of 2022. Loki and the Falcon show had the same issue, where both felt like ads for the next few films, filling in the blanks that would otherwise go unexplored. Loki opened up the multiverse and set up a new villain in Kang, who will be returning in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania coming 2023, and the other one transitioned Falcon into Captain America, and set up a bunch of other eventual characters, movies, and storylines that will be expanded upon in later MCU ventures. As I said, the overarching storyline for Phase 4 seems to be the multiverse, but we got a bunch of other threads on top of that. The multiverse feels like something that's thrown in to be an excuse to shove in other characters or variants of things we know. Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, Patrick Stewart Professor X, Ben Affleck Daredevil. But there are other stories at play as well. In addition to the multiverse, you also have the Thunderbolts, who so far consist of John Walker from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Black Widow's sister, and as far as I know, that's it so far. Initially, I thought they'd be used for an upcoming Avengers thing, but recently it was announced that a movie centering around them will be released, so the whole concept reads as throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. You also have the Celestials set up in the Eternals and will maybe leak over to the Guardians films, and there was also that weird tease with the sword and blade at the end of that movie. It's all a big mess, and I don't necessarily have an issue with having small storylines within one big story. In fact, I'd prefer it. I want smaller contained stories, but every one of these can't help the impulse to try and shove in some kind of teaser crap. The films in phases 1 to 3 did the same thing, but those movies had a defined end goal and a big bad to build up to. Like, yeah, 4-2 was a disposable nothing movie, but it showed off and established the reality stone that gets used in Infinity War, and that was pretty important. Doctor Strange was a pretty mid film, but it had the time stone in it, established its rules, and implemented a character that would serve a major role in future movies. But this multiverse through line seems very ill-defined and doesn't really seem to be building to anything other than to maybe bring in the X-Men or completely reboot the franchise. Same goes for all the other things going on. The Marvels and Secret Invasion are apparently going to be showing off the development of a Skrull invasion in the Marvel Universe, and I can't see how that will have anything to do with anything, or really have any place in this universe other than being an excuse to have all these characters cross over again, which I'm completely over at this point. Cinematic universes have now become something that's almost expected in the modern franchise landscape. You got the MCU, the SSU, the Sony Spider-Man universe, which is sort of in the MCU, but not really. It's got Venom, Vulture, and Dr. Michael Morbius in it. DC has the DCEU, which is their main continuity. It's kind of a clusterfuck that had no plan, but there's some good stuff in there. There's also the Matt Reeves Batman universe, which will have tie-in spin-off TV shows to accompany each movie. Star Wars is trying its hand at a big connected TV universe, which is worthy of its own video in and of itself. It's exhausting at this point. I don't know about all of you, but for me, I'm getting a little tired of the constant cameos and references that are being expected to sell tickets to go see these movies. Let's be real, the vast majority didn't go to watch the Multiverse of Madness because they loved the character of Dr. Stephen Strange or wanted to see Sam Raimi's return to the superhero genre. They went to see it because they thought they'd get to see Dr. Michael Morbius, Professor Charles Xavier, and Blackie Gar Boltigan.
Hit a guy, hit it there.
Apart from the cameos and the admittedly amazing direction and visual flair from Sam Raimi, what you're left with in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is a pretty dull and forgettable story and experience. The action isn't particularly rooted in anything meaningful, the protagonist is really bland and his arc is mostly forgettable. Given the way the MCU is attempting to elevate some of its properties now, you can't help but reflect on Martin Scorsese. Good old Marty. Remember when he made the film about the Wall Street guy who said fuck and beat his wife? Good times. A couple of years ago, the Marvel fanboy and film side of the internet lost their collective shit over Martin the Wolf Scorsese saying in an interview that Marvel movies are not cinema. Which is definitely a loaded statement to make, that I don't really care to debate when taken at its surface level. What Scorsese was actually trying to posit is that Marvel movies fundamentally do not provide the same experience as your typical view of what a movie is. Using the metaphor of theme park rides, each film essentially functions as its own attraction, providing brief bursts of dopamine. Essentially, when you go and see an Avengers film, you're not going for the sake of getting an emotional and cinematic experience. You're going because it's an attraction, because you want to see who will turn up, what will happen, the big crowd-pleasing moments. Your favorite mascot fighting a big purple asshole. Bear in mind, this is Marty's opinion and not mine. The statement of them all not being cinema and instead theme park rides is a little bit of an oversimplification. If emotion and aesthetic are metrics for what makes cinema, then why are films like Guardians of the Galaxy lumped in with this theme park idea? Because that's a movie wherein its emotion and characters come before anything else. Like I said, what is and isn't cinema is a pointless debate that comes down to subjectivity and how pretentious you are. But digging past the surface level of what Marty the Ace Scorsese was getting at is a sentiment I agree with and is apparent now more than ever. People aren't watching most of these shows and movies because they're looking for art that will satisfy or challenge a worldview or desire. Plenty are just empty spectacle with a paper-thin story to service the action or the cameos. Factory filmmaking is a real thing, and if there's one thing Martin Scorsese is right about, is that it's an incredibly damaging precedent for the industry as a whole. When referring to the current oversaturation of the superhero genre, Martin Scorsese said,
"In many places around this country and around the world, franchise films are now your primary choice if you want to see something on the big screen. If you're going to tell me that it's simply a matter of supply and demand and giving the people what they want, I'm going to disagree. It's a chicken and egg issue. If people are only given one kind of thing and endlessly sold only one kind of thing, of course they're going to want more of that one kind of thing."
And I tend to agree. It's too much. It's unhealthy for the industry and it's unhealthy for our minds. I'm by no means immune either. I went to see Doctor Strange because I didn't want to be left behind with the rest of the world and because I was interested in the cameo potential of the film. That She-Hulk show looks really lame and kind of bad, but I'll see it just because I want to see Daredevil show up. So many of these movies sell their appeal on that promise of somebody significant or somebody who will be significant showing up. I think a lot of the things Martin Scorsese said about Marvel is kind of misinformed and hyperbolic, but honestly, the metaphor comparing the MCU to a theme park is a perfect analogy. When making this video, I went back to see a couple of older MCU releases, chief amongst them being Iron Man 1, the first Avengers film, and Avengers Endgame, which are an interesting selection because it shows a massive divide between Marvel in their beginnings to Marvel at its peak of success. Marvel had taken a massive risk in starting this whole cinematic venture initially. The company was in debt, and unless their name was Spider-Man or Wolverine, nobody gave a shit about giving some obscure comic book character a chance in their own movie. So Iron Man was a very risky film. Nobody cared about the character. It was coming out at a time of steep competition and had lofty aspirations to be much bigger than its one movie, a risk that was worth $525 million in the entire Marvel catalogue. So what you're left with is a movie that feels bizarrely out of place when contrasted with the rest of the MCU's content. It didn't sell itself on its IP, its lead actor was someone who had a spotty reputation and wasn't well known by the general public. It didn't sell itself on cameos and Easter eggs because they knew nobody would care about showing off Nick Fury or S.H.I.E.L.D. It was a movie that wanted to be a big summer blockbuster that would attract a general audience and leave a lasting impression. Even today, the movie has a lot of stuff in it that is sorely missed in its future entries. The actual Iron Man suit still looks amazing. For 2008, it really does hold up to modern standards. It looks real, it's full of grime and muck, and when it takes damage, you see and feel that. And despite being super small scale, Iron Man 1 still feels big and bonkers bombastic. Rewatching the first Avengers film and seeing this team of contrasting personalities band together and coordinate against this one threat still feels great. The action, while being comparatively small to later films, is still creative and dynamic. Revisiting later entries into the MCU, I can't say I got the same feeling. I said at the beginning that Endgame was an amazing finale and I stand by that, but watching the film again I noticed a lot of problems that were not apparent in the first time I watched it. Iron Man 1 isolated is a great action blockbuster. Avengers still stands on its own as an entertaining superhero ensemble. If you watched it with no context like I did when I was a little baby boy, it's still a great movie. But I can't say the same for Endgame. When you think about the most memorable parts of the film, it's either all empty spectacle that doesn't really mean anything without context, or great character moments that also don't really mean anything without context. It isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it really does feel more like a theme park ride than an actual movie that stands on its own. You get to visit all your old favourite locations for a third of the runtime, filled with plenty of fan service and callback to things you know. The last third is a big dumb final battle in a really grim and bland location that was so huge and cluttered that I got a massive headache when I watched it for the first time. The actual craft of the movie was more of an afterthought, with the attraction going first and foremost. Iron Man 1 had sick ass sound design accompanied with amazing visual effects and a really slick, heavy looking suit that carried a lot of presence and weight. But in every subsequent film that's lost and traded out for an empty visual effect thrown in to get the job done, which is honestly how the presentation for the rest of these movies feel. But I don't want to sound like a broken, pretentious record. I do like these movies still, despite what I said. I don't strictly hold the belief that old was good and new is bad. Thor 1, The Hulk and Captain America were unbearably mid on rewatch. Infinity War is a very good movie and balances being a great event as well as being an amazing movie, with a strict focus on one character, as well as an amazing screenplay that leaves you satisfied. I talked a lot about the idea of these movies being made as theme park rides and why that's kind of lame, but there's good ways to do it and there's bad. When talking about a film that sells itself purely on attraction and cheap dopamine rushes, no movie exemplifies that more than No Way Home. It didn't become one of the highest grossing movies of all time because it was groundbreaking or because it was directed by John the Man Watts. It was because it had a lot of the things you knew in it, as well as a character that no matter what people will want to see. But despite that, No Way Home remains probably the best entry in Phase 4 due to the way it actually uses its nostalgia fanbase to inform its story. Doctor Strange had a lot of empty, vapid callbacks and setups that are the very worst of what I'm talking about. No Way Home having all these different villains from all these different movies actually means something. It tests Spider-Man's values, gives him some loss and challenges that change him and his world in a very substantial way. It's a genuinely good Spider-Man movie that isn't concerned with advancing the trajectory of the MCU and more so is focused on advancing its lead character and taking him in a new and interesting direction. It is set in that universe, but unlike other movies, it isn't overly reliant on that continuity. What references the movie does have to the wider universe come about because they diegetically fit into the direction of the story instead of being a baseless reference or member-berry to a thing you know. It's there are links and callbacks, but the movie isn't wholly dependent on it. I've said this before, but if I had it my way, these shows and movies would go back to what they were at the beginning. Small-scale, isolated stories focused on its characters within one continuity. At this point, I feel it's hurting the MCU more than anything to double down so hard on setups and trying to cling on even harder to everything being linked, but with no variety whatsoever. Moon Knight was a show that severely disappointed me recently. A superhero in this universe suffering with dissociative identity disorder, burdened with being the glorified hitman to an Egyptian entity, was a really interesting concept, and one that to my knowledge is very well explored within his source material. When marketing the show, Disney advertised that it would be returning to Iron Man 1's roots, in that its priority would be in introducing and establishing its title character, in favour of using them as a vehicle to set up something else, going as far to say that the project would be mostly unrelated to the broader MCU. And credit where credit is due, it lived up to its promise of not being burdened with constant nods to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as the show was practically devoid of any of the desperate references films like Eternals felt the need to shove in. But credit revoked because it refused to take advantage of that fact. Something I loved about the Netflix shows is that even though they took place within that continuity, they never felt hampered by it. When disconnected, they can tell much smaller stake and personal stories that you would never see adequately represented within a feature-length blockbuster with the Marvel label on it. Moon Knight and more generally the rest of the Disney Plus shows should be doing smaller stake stuff like The Defenders, but they don't. There are elements of focused character exploration in there of very questionable quality, but mostly the shows are all of massive stakes equal to the movies. Stop an all-knowing, all-powerful agency that are restricting free will and essentially killing dozens of worlds. Prevent a terrorist organization from fucking up global infrastructure, all the while grappling with a legacy that is one of the primary figureheads of this universe. And stop a bizarre cult who worship a big crocodile lady from releasing said crocodile lady that will eat all the souls of everyone on Earth who isn't 100% a nice guy. And you've got to stop them, Moon Knight, and you only have 6 episodes to do it, where most of it is boring dicking around elongated to a 40-minute runtime, and having very surface level explorations of the main themes. I'm trying really hard to bite my tongue on this show because I fully intend to make a more thorough video on it in the future. But if I were to try and distill a major issue I have with it briefly, it's that modern MCU, and arguably the MCU in general, has a real problem with maturity in their stories. And for the record, by that I don't mean I want sex, gore, and violence in all these movies and TV shows. It's not The Boys. End of the day, the MCU is a family franchise. They have their own park at Disneyland and are designed to be as broadly appealing as possible. I'm not a total idiot. I'm not suggesting the MCU goes hard on making everything R-rated. There are some characters that deserve it and there are some who don't. The point I'm trying to make is that Marvel has been pretty cowardly when it comes to projects that deal with mature subject matter, offering either surface level explorations or straying away from the topics entirely. WandaVision's grief stuff was cool, but after a while that slowly dissipated to make way for dumb MCU bullshit. And I don't know what the fuck Eternals was meant to be. It's recently been confirmed that Marvel Studios will be picking up a Daredevil project for Disney+, essentially being a season 4 to the really good TV show that was canned along with the rest of the Marvel Netflix slate. And if any of the other projects so far have been any indication, it won't be able to do the character justice and will skip past vital components of him. You don't necessarily need violence and death to make a good Daredevil show, but elements like his Catholicism, generational trauma, the juxtaposition between vigilantism and commitment to the system, as well as the general concept of violence are vital components that would be a huge disservice to gloss over in favor of having him fight ninjas or a weird cult. I hope that Marvel does course correct though and play to the strength of their roster. Superhero fatigue is the result of getting too much of one thing, but there are multiple different avenues for diversifying that I feel are going greatly ignored. I'm getting the feeling that the more these movies progress, the more they feel like actual comic books. Certain runs are better than others, big events are the primary moneymakers, and like a lot of comic books, when they get desperate, they start doing stupid shit like giving chances dumb ideas that are dumb like the Eternals. I'm always going to be interested in the Guardians as long as James Gunn is around, and I like the direction they're taking with Spider-Man, or at least the direction I feel like they're going. But my interest is in these characters and these directors. Eventually Tom Holland is going to stop being Spider-Man, and Guardians 3 is looking to be an end to the series as a whole. IP isn't enough of a sell anymore. The cinematic universe format is getting very dull and tired without any variety. And as individual projects, I'm not getting the same kick as I would watching any of the countless better movies and TV shows that are available. The MCU is stretching itself thin. It has too much content and the quality is slipping with each new release, fated to forever take one step forward, 2 steps back. Marvel has lost its star, its big bad, and its direction. And the attempt it's trying to make at keeping me around and ensuring I stay on this journey they're building is not working.